Hello and welcome to the Stormont Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Stormont and inside policymaking for Northern Ireland. I'm David McCann, and also on the podcast are Tim Kerns, former special advisor to DUP First Minister Peter Robinson and head of policy for the party. Hello, Tim.
Hi, David.
And we also have our other regular, Michael McKernan. Michael was special advisor to the SDLP. He worked in the executive from 2007 to 2016. Hello, Michael.
Hiya, David. Hiya, Tim.
Today, we're looking at a very important topic. We're looking at the impact of gambling harm in Northern Ireland. Now, gambling is something that all of us see every day. In many ways, it is accepted as a normal part of our society, but less talked about is the harm that gambling addiction is doing to many people in our society. Northern Ireland has one of the highest rates of what is termed gambling harm on these islands. Campaigners have been calling for better regulation in this area, but Stormont has been slow to act. So in this episode of the podcast, we're going to be asking why, and we're going to be talking to an MLA who is looking to make a change in this area. You can watch the conversation on YouTube. Search for Stormont Sources, where we upload clips for you to enjoy. Head on to YouTube, subscribe to our channel there for videos and updates. You can follow us on X, watch clips on TikTok. You can also follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our mailing list at stormontsources.com. Remember to leave us a podcast review on your listening app. Also, if it's anything less than 4 stars, please don't bother. You can WhatsApp us also on 0333 404 6507. Remember to use the word Stormont so we know it's for this podcast. And you can also send us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. Now, on to the topic that we're going to be looking at today. A bit of a different format than we usually do. We're only focusing on one topic today. So as I was saying in the intro, campaigners have been calling for better regulation of the gambling industry within Northern Ireland. But Stormont has been slow to act, and they have received criticism over this. So there's currently an all-party group at Stormont that's looking at reducing gambling harm. They're a collection of MLAs who've come together to try and push this issue forward. So to go through his own story of dealing with gambling harm and what we need to do to tackle this issue, we're delighted to be joined today by the chair of the all-party group on reducing gambling harm, the chair of the Health Committee, and Sinn Féin MLA for North Antrim, Philip McGuigan. Philip, we're delighted you've joined us here on Stormont Sources today.
Thanks for having me. Morning to you as well.
So Philip, just to start off with, you've been public about your own story, your own issues with gambling. So I wanted to just start off by asking, because I don't think a lot of people are maybe familiar with kind of how easy it is to get sucked into kind of addiction and gambling addiction. So could you just, as far as you're comfortable with, walk us through a wee bit about your own story, about how you got in, about how this kind of, I don't know how this got hold of you. I don't even know if that's even the right terminology to use, Philip, but just a bit of your own story.
Well, I mean, it is very easy, in particular in the modern society, to become addicted to gambling, to suffer gambling related harm, because nowadays most people are walking about with a casino in their pockets via their iPhones. You know, the majority of my gambling, in fact, all of my gambling was done online. So, you know, it was either an iPad, it was either a laptop, or it was either my phone. So, I mean, these are things that we have with us all day long. I mean, there's no closing time online. So, I mean, you can access the gambling markets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, in that kind of a scenario, when you're dealing with kind of unregulated times, when you're being bombarded by the levels of advertising that we are in modern society, particularly if you're into sport, you know, it's impossible to escape gambling advertising. And then when you're also dealing with harmful products, you know, it is very easy to become a sufferer of gambling related harm. I sometimes struggle talking to people who maybe don't understand addiction, when they would, you know, they'll say to me, but you're, you know, when you started to lose money, why did you not stop? And it is very difficult to explain to somebody the powerful nature of an addiction, whether it's gambling, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's alcohol addiction. Addiction to me is one of the most powerful illnesses there is, where this mental compulsion, overcomes everything. I mean, I have said in the past that by and large, I consider myself to be a reasonably sensible person. I'm very strong-willed. When I set my mind to something, by and large, I'm disciplined and can do it. But all of that goes out the window when that compulsion to gamble was within me. It overtook everything. I put the gambling above myself, my own health, physical and mental. I put it above. I'm embarrassed to say it now, but I put it above my family and the well-being of my family. That's just how powerful it is. And unfortunately, the most recent prevalence surveys here in the north show that my experience isn't a solitary one. That the number of people who suffer from gambling-related harm here in the north, as you said in the introduction, vastly surpasses the figures across these islands. So it is something that I'm very passionate about, but I believe from an individual perspective, because of my own experience, but I am the chair of the health committee. Gambling, all kinds of addiction are a very important uh, health element, and we do need to deal with that. It doesn't just affect individuals. So, I mean, when we talk about a public health approach, we do so because, gambling impacted me as an individual, but it impacted my family, it impacted my friends, it impacted my employment. Unfortunately, we see the impacts of gambling before the courts, the judicial system, and certainly within our health system. And unfortunately, the levels of suicide, particularly young men, who suffer gambling harm, is something that we need to deal with. So, gambling is very pervasive, and it does need to be dealt with in a public health approach in the same way that we regulate and deal with tobacco, alcohol, and drugs.
Yeah, so obviously, because your dad, so you went through a couple of issues there, Philip. I just want to unpack a few of them there. So you were talking there about obviously supports there. So what was your own experience of support services? Because a lot of people, and I have a close family member who is a recovering alcoholic. One of the things that they were always telling me, and he has similar experience to you, Philip. It struggles to, it's hard to explain to someone who doesn't suffer from that kind of to get in the mindset. But one of the things that he would always say to me is that you can't shame someone out of an addiction. It's embarrassing to admit that you've got an alcohol problem. Same thing for you. It's embarrassing to admit that you've got a gambling problem or whatever addiction it may be. So, what about your experience of support services? I mean, did you find that they were there for you when you needed them, or did you have problems accessing them? Because one thing in researching this I've found is that quite a few people do have difficulty accessing kind of support services when they need them. So, what was your experience?
Yeah, I mean, our support services right across the board for addictions here in the north are well below par. I mean, with regard to gambling, they're pretty much non-existent from the statutory provision point of view. So, I mean, in terms of addiction, it's kind of uh, you know, if somebody told me if I went to a health professional and was diagnosed with diabetes, I would either take tablets or inject myself, and that would, be the treatment. If you're told you've heart disease, you'll be given medication. You'll take that regularly to try and combat that. If you have cancer, you will go for various treatments. The thing about addiction is, even though you know that you suffer from this addiction, you don't want to give it up. I mean, and that's why, unfortunately, the levels of suicide among people who suffer from addiction is so high, because, it does at times take people to hit rock bottom before they, first of all, will admit that they have a problem and seek help. So, I mean, that was my experience. I had to hit rock bottom with regard to gambling, and I mean, there's still a stigma, and that's one of the things that the APG with gambling harm are trying to do, is kind of reduce the nature of the stigma attached to gambling harm. But I mean, when I did get myself to a position where I sought help, I mean, there just isn't help. There literally is no help here in the north for gambling. I was lucky I was able to access the White Oaks Rehabilitation Centre in Donegal, which I mean I would attribute to saving my life at that time, to be honest with you. But you know that wasn't Donegal. It's not. It wasn't here. So I mean, we do have some very very good voluntary and community sector help. You know, there's the Dunlewey Centre, Quanmura, you know, Chapter One, Extern Gambling, and I mean Gamblers Anonymous. Again, you know, I would attribute to my recovery. So you know, there are community and voluntary services out there, but we have nothing here in the north. I mean, if you take in England, for example, there are 15 standalone gambling centres for recovery, and as I say, we have none in the north, even though our figures vastly outweigh what they are across the water.
Were you, I mean, because Phil, obviously when you came in as an MLA in 2016, I mean, was there, because you talked there about the stigma, right? And there aren't many MLAs I can think of. I was trying to think back. Were there any other MLAs who've like admitted to any kind of addiction and I can't, I struggled. I really struggled to think of any. I think you're actually one of the, I think you're either the first or you're certainly one of the, one of the few who've ever admitted to something. In terms of the stigma, were you nervous about that? Because obviously you're an MLAs get, we've spoken about it here, truckloads of abuse as it is. I mean, so putting yourself out there, that exposing that vulnerability, I suppose, were you nervous about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did think long and hard about it, to be honest with you, David. I mean, it sounds strange that I'm an MLA, I'm a public representative, and put myself before the public, but I'm actually a very private person. My family are very private. You know, I don't I didn't like talking about myself. So I mean, I did. I mean, it maybe wasn't a completely closed secret. You know, I had some in the media asking me long before I did go, would I talk about it? And I always said no. But with the APG, you know, I just felt it was something that my experience could help other people. And to be honest with you, that has been my experience since, where, you know, because I have opened up about my own experience, I have been able now in circumstances to direct other people who are suffering from gambling harm to places where they can get help themselves. So, I mean, from that point of view, I'm glad that I did open up about it, but also, I mean, it does allow me to do the like of this, where, you know, I do believe we need tighter regulation. We need to deal with the advertising. So it's something that we need to deal with from a political perspective. And the fact that I'm able to share my own experiences, I think, has been very helpful in that regard as well.
Well, let's get on to this because absolutely, you know, I don't think people kind of appreciate how unregulated the North is actually in this space. So let's get on to some of the work that the APG are trying to push. I mean, why is it taking us so long to actually do something about it? Why has Stormont been seen to kind of drag its heels a bit on this, Philip? What is the reason for that slowness?
Well, I mean, I suppose one of the frustrations as a political representative when you're dealing with any kind of legislation is just the bureaucracy and the length of it, and sometimes the frustration of delays. Uh, this this piece of legislation that we're hoping to introduce, uh, we're told is going to be the biggest piece of legislation ever to come before the North. So, I mean, in terms of setting a context, our gambling laws here are from 1985, which is, you know, far too long for any piece of legislation to be renewed and reviewed. I mean, there was no such thing as online gambling in 1985. So we really do need to update our laws. The levels of harm, the levels of regulation that are needed have completely accelerated since 1985. I am as frustrated as everybody else that hasn't been the case. I mean, unfortunately, the last two assembly terms have been shortened terms. So, I mean, my own colleague Deirdre Hargett did bring forward some changes, you know, amendment through the 1920 or the 2022 Amendment Act that deals with some issues within land-based gambling. She at that time said that because of the length and the complication of the online aspect of it, we just couldn't do it in a shortened term. And unfortunately, the same argument's been used by Gordon Lyons in this term, that it is just too big a piece of legislation and too complicated to get through in a short mandate. So unfortunately, it isn't going to come through in this time. But I mean, that doesn't stop us making sure that the minister and the department are doing preparatory work, so that whenever the new term starts, that we do hit the ground running with regard to this. I mean, it's unfortunate. That's the reasons given by the departments, and we're just going to have to accept it in this case.
So in terms of actually kind of the policy, so the Republic are doing a big update of their gambling legislation at present. There has been updates across the water in Westminster as well. In terms of where the policy kind of needs to go, I mean, is there anything in those different approaches that maybe could provide a pathway for if I mean whether the DP hold the department after the next assembly election or not, for the next communities minister, whether it's Gordon Lands or whoever, to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I should have said at the start, I mean, I obviously chair the APG on reducing gambling harm, but it's a very hard-working APG, and it does really have good cross-community support. I work with my colleagues from all the parties on the APG, and we're all on the one hymn sheet, as it were, with what we want to see happening and what we think we need to see happening. So, I mean, also, it's important to say that just because of the interconnectedness of these islands, it does impact us what happens across the water. It certainly impacts us what happens in the south. And we do what we would like to see is the kind of harmonization of laws and regulations right across the island. I mean, because there's no escaping the amount of people here who watch Premier League soccer on TV that being bombarded by gambling companies, and the same with horse racing across the islands. So it does need to be targeted. So I mean, you're right. In the south, they have brought forward their own legislation, so they have now got a gambling regulator. So in the north, we're the only part of these islands that doesn't have an independent gambling regulator or gambling commission that will, regulate gambling operators. So they have that in the south. They've brought forward a social fund which they will use from a levy to target education on gambling harm and research and treatment. And then they've also, which I think is very beneficial, they have a kind of moratorium on gambling advertising on TV and radio from 5:30 in the morning to 9 p at night. I think that is a very important aspect of it. They've other things in it in terms of self-exclusion, etc., etc. So, I mean, that is what we would be liking to see happening here in the north across the water. I mean, they obviously have their gambling commission as well. They now have introduced a gambling levy on online regulators. So that's something that we think that we should be benefiting from here in the north. So, I mean, our people here in the north can obviously access the online companies that they're helping to boost the huge profits that some of the betting companies have. And, we're not benefiting from that online levy. So we have been in discussion, and I know a couple of the ministers and the executive have been in discussion with the British counterpart, in the hope that we can very, very quickly actually get our fair share of that levy. So what we've been told is that the British minister is open to the North getting a share of that, but there's some work for the Department of Health to do in terms of kind of identifying the level of harm from online gambling, so that it can be attributed. So, I mean, we would like to see that levy come on our way, and we'd like to see it being used, say, research, education, prevention, and treatment.
Yeah, and then obviously, and this will be my last question, Jay. Obviously, then the need then is to make sure that that's ring fenced for support, because I'm actually a wee bit flummoxed by the lack of supports that you've been outlining there. You've been mentioning this exists in England. You had to go to Donegal and the Republic for support for yourself, and yet very little exists in Northern Ireland. So there obviously is a big piece of work of getting resource in to build up the infrastructure to support people with gambling addictions.
Absolutely. And as I say, I mean, we all know the levels of profit that the gambling companies are making, I mean, it's astronomical. So, I mean, what we're saying, nearly in terms of a polluter pays, gambling products cause harm. As I say, these aren't just individual harms; they're community and societal harms. So we believe that the levy should be at an appropriate figure to represent that harm, and it should be used for the the prevention, regulation, education, and treatment of harm, particularly here in the north. I mean, and that's just in the absence of our own legislation in the next mandate, where hopefully we can do some of these things from our own perspective. But like, I just want to see us being able to help our citizens. I mean, you talked there about been shocked at the prevention of service, and I might get a wee bit political here, and this isn't on behalf of the APG. This is, our public services have been, you know, decimated by previous Westminster governments, and nowhere is that seen more than in health. And we had a public health debate in the Assembly in relation to gambling, and the Minister, I think, would be sympathetic to some of our asks, but he's saying that he literally just doesn't have the money to do these things. So, public services have been decimated by Westminster. The levy will go some way if we can get it to doing some good in relation to gambling harm, but it isn't going to solve all the problems within our health service, and it certainly isn't going to solve all the problems in addressing gambling harm. This needs to be a two-pronged approach, three-pronged approach, regulation, and then enforcement, and also then from a public health perspective.
Okay. Look, it's a really, really, really serious topic, and some of the statistics about gambling harm in Northern Ireland are truly terrifying. So it is something that the executive does need to get on ASAP. Look, so we wish you well and your colleagues in the APG in your campaign, Philip. So thank you so much for coming, sharing your story, and sharing your insights about where we need to go.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to talk about the important subject.
Okay, so you were listening there to the MLA for North Antrim, chair of the all-party group on reducing gambling harm, Philip McGuigan. Tim, I know this is something that you care passionately about, something that you work on. Um, Reducing gambling harm. I mean, until we actually talked about doing this topic, I have to say I was quite ignorant of the scale of the challenge here, which is to my great embarrassment. Stormont dragging its heels. Let's start off with that. And we spoke last week to Ciara Fitzpatrick on the anti-poverty strategy. Same type of story, dragging their heels 20 years. I mean, it just seems to be that it's quite a big, comprehensive piece of legislation. And yeah, we've had the shortened mandates, but 2007 to 2017, surely we could have been doing something in that period, in those 9 years, no?
Yeah, and this isn't just a DUP problem. Obviously, Gordon Lyons holds the ministry now, and we could easily point the finger at him and say, you need to do something about this. But there's been 10 ministers who've held this position, not just the Department of Communities, but Social Development before then. And nobody has brought in anything comprehensive. The only piece of legislation that's been brought in was in 2022, which actually increased what the industry could do in Northern Ireland to give them more operating time and to give them more protections. Now, it did bring in at that time a code of practice, but this is the fundamental problem. Whatever we do to support people in gambling harm practically, like a code of practice, it can't be enforced because there's no regulator to enforce it. So who enforces the code of practice that we now have in to ensure fairness in the gambling industry? Well, is it the PSNI who enforces that? Is it the district councils who enforce that? The department says it's not them who should enforce that. So we've got this shiny new code of practice, which looks great, but actually is pretty much irrelevant to everyday life for people in gambling harm until we get someone in to regulate that. So that's the first piece that we need to have in this. We need to put in place a regulator, and we can fund that through, as Philip pointed out, a levy. We can fund that, through, I think, the Department of Communities as well. There is money available. It goes back to what we were talking about last week. There are choices that the executive have made, and these choices have practical outflowings, and unfortunately they have devastating real world effects for people in gambling harm and in other addictions as well, because they're not getting the support that they need to get, which is available in other parts of the UK.
Michael, obviously you've had experience of some of these departments that would have dealt with them. I know you were in social development. Why do you think it's taken so long without any kind of update on this, without any kind of tackling of or meaningful update of the rules to tackle the issue?
Well, I think the main reason is because it's tricky and it's difficult and they've avoided it. And there's a powerful lobby on the other side of the argument trying to promote all the gambling, and it's a well-heeled lobby. Firstly, can I say fair play to Philip for coming on and telling us about his own personal situation. I think that takes a degree of courage, and it's admirable that he comes on and his mission is to help others. There's a thing I have at the heart of this, which is people say there are no services, there are no support services, and addiction is a terrible thing, and gambling addiction is just one element of all the addictions that are out there in society and doing enormous damage in society. The support services cost money. The money is not available to enhance them or improve them or extend them, so they don't get extended. But the other sad thing about all of this, and I think there's hardly any family, my own included, where there isn't some addiction in and around the family somewhere. These services aren't guaranteed to work. You know, Philip mentioned some health conditions, and by and large, certain health conditions, physical health conditions, when you get the treatment, it works, and by and large, you can manage the situation. Quite often, the support services that are available for addiction are the likes of counselling and talking therapies and all of that, and they're not guaranteed to work. The person has to go out into the real world and still try and beat their addiction and fight that lonely battle themselves. So it's very difficult. Tim is right not to party politicise it. There's been ministers of all parties who've had responsibility for this. And I think the truth is that unless it became an executive priority on a cross-departmental basis, that they make resources available to extend the services, then it's not going to happen. It's a bit of a bridesmaid in terms of the executive's priorities.
Tim, in terms of where we go from here, obviously there's not going to be much done, it seems like, before 2027 outside of the work that the APG are doing. So how do you kind of really turbocharge this to get action from 2027? Because the issue is, I suppose, there's always going to be a cry. I mean, look, Northern Ireland politics is never more than a year or two away from like a crisis of some sort. I mean, in the next mandate, even if the Assembly goes the full term, there'll still be issues that the parties fall out over. There'll be a bit of paralysis. It may not come down, but there may be a bit of paralysis in there. So how do you make sure that this doesn't fall victim again to kind of just stagnation?
Well, Michael's right. It has to become a priority of the executive. I mean, it needs to be in the programme for government. Look, this is an interesting area of policy because there could be money made available. I actually think this is one area that we should consider handing powers back to Westminster, because the way this can be funded is through taxing the industry, and Gordon Brown recently put forward an idea that 50% of gross gambling yield should go to fund all the gambling harm that there is, and also cover the 6 or 7 billion that's needed in terms of welfare. So he was making the point, and this is not unique, other countries tax gambling to a very high degree and very high level. A lot of countries are over 50% in what they take from gambling, recognizing the harm that it does. So if we were to do something similar to that, I mean, 16.1 billion is gross gambling yield in the UK. I mean, that's an astronomical sum. You can't even conceive of how much that is. So if
That's
we
nearly
were to,
the entire yearly budget for Northern Ireland.
Exactly, and so if we were to take 50% of that, as Gordon Brown says, you could pay for every support service that is needed to treat everybody who's in gambling harm, provide the education and research that you need to put in place to prevent others getting into gambling harm, and you could fill the gap that's needed by the Chancellor in terms of the welfare budget. And I think, we need to start to be innovative in that. But I think from Northern Ireland's perspective, I don't think we are ever going to have the capability to tap into that, because look, there's a gambling levy has been put in place for GB. Now, it's quite a complicated legal framework, and I'll not bore people with what that is. But let's say we have already given back powers, certain powers, not all the power, but certain powers on advertising to Westminster. That was required because TalkSport or Hard FM, all of these big national broadcasters that rely on gambling advertising, ITV, it relies on gambling advertising as well, couldn't broadcast in Northern Ireland. So if there's a television program that has a gambling, Foxy Bingo or something at the start of the program, which This Morning used to have, that could not broadcast in Northern Ireland because of the way our laws were. So we handed those laws back to Westminster again for the benefit of the industry, so as the industry could avail of the 2005 changes in advertising law. So we were pretty keen to hand power back when it was a benefit to the industry. I think we should hand gambling powers back to Westminster to be in the benefit of the person who's in gambling harm, because I think it's only when we do that we're going to see proper regulation. It's only when we do that we're going to be able to avail of levies in terms of online gambling. I don't think our legislation is going to be able to cope with that. So in some way, we need to see gambling better regulated on a UK and Ireland basis as well. I think that there is a way that we could set up through the gambling levy when we bring money in to set up, support services on an all-island basis, because, as Philip says, there's 15 service centres across England, Scotland and Wales. What about we have a network of 4 or 5 service centres across the island of Ireland? Philip went to Donegal. I mean, you have one in Belfast, a couple on the borders, Dublin, Cork, Galway, and we fund those jointly, and those are open to everybody. I mean, there's got to be innovative ways of dealing with this, and there is ways that we can fund this as well. But I think that starts with us taking an even braver decision to say, look, we did hand back partial advertising powers. Let's just hand the whole thing back, and let's try and get this regulated better, because I don't think we're ever going to do it. I think we'll still be here in 10 years' time having a discussion of why have we done nothing on this, because it's too hard. I'm very critical of civil servants, and I'm very critical of them in this. It is far too difficult for our civil service to deal with and do. This power needs to be given back so that a bigger civil service team on a UK and Ireland basis can deal with it across the islands and try and help.
And also, I mean, you've got mechanisms through things like the British Irish Council. There's no reason why you couldn't have them do a couple of formal sessions between the governments on gambling reform, where everyone comes and where all the governments come together and they agree, look, we will do A, B, C and D, and we will put forward X, Y, Z legislation, and we'll do it jointly, and we'll come together.
And reform is happening to the south of us, and reform is happening across the water in GB as well, and there's nothing happening here. It's recognised that the regulator's not working in GB, and that's across the piece. Labour and Conservatives all recognise that the regulator's not working, and they're about to change their approach and what they're doing, and we haven't even got out of the starting traps in 1985.
Michael, in terms of, I mean, getting this as a priority in the next kind of programme for government, I mean, it's not in there at the minute. It's not really talked about, even though Northern Ireland has some really frightening statistics actually on gambling harm in comparison to the rest of the UK. In fact, actually, some of them stand out on a European level as well, not just on a UK-Ireland level. I mean, in terms of getting this as a priority in the next programme for government, do you see appetite coming from DUP, Sinn Féin?
No, I don't see any appetite because, as I said before, it is difficult, and our politicians tend to avoid the difficult. I'm not sure I agree with Tim about handing back the powers, although, I mean, my instinct would be surely we can do better for our own people than they're going to do for us in London with the same amount of money.
Why wouldn't we hand them back?
But I'm open to being persuaded because it should go wherever the evidence points us. But I don't think it'd be a priority. And largely the victims of gambling harm and other addiction harm, they don't have much of a voice. They don't have political power. So it would take the DUP or Sinn Féin in particular to say this is something we need to grip. And I'm not as, I don't want to use the word defeatist, but I'm not as negative on our capabilities here as Tim might be in terms of handing the power back. We should be capable of levying the very rich industry that promotes gambling and is therefore responsible ultimately for some of the harm. We should be able to levy them sufficiently to get the resources to set up our own gambling regulator that will police and implement a code of practice. And our health service should be capable of setting up a service centre, treatment support centre, or several centres. We should be capable of doing that. But I know I'll defer to Tim. This issue is nearly Tim's day job, and he knows a lot more about it than I do. So I have an open mind, but I don't see why we can't do it. But I can see why it's not a political priority.
I think just to answer that question directly, of course, this isn't devolved in Scotland and Wales, and for very good reason it's not devolved in Scotland and Wales.
Why was it devolved here, Tim?
What's that, sorry?
Why was it devolved here?
Well, because it was devolved here under the old Stormont regime, and basically in '98, anything that Stormont did back in the old days was just simply handed over, and gambling was one of those things. And the big innovation, and Philip talked about this, is online. So there's a grey area of what we can actually do. What can we regulate in the online world? Because online is essentially a reserved matter. But yet gambling online is a devolved matter. So how can we don't actually have the levers to regulate the internet part of this. So we have if you want to gamble online in Northern Ireland, you want to set up a gambling company to gamble online in Northern Ireland, you have to have a GB gambling license, a GB online gambling license, and that allows you to enter into the Northern Ireland market. If I start gambling online and get into gambling harm or feel I've been mistreated by that GB company, who do I make a complaint to? Well, the Gambling Commission aren't going to investigate my complaint because they've no jurisdiction over the harm that's caused from that license in Northern Ireland. But yet harm has been caused. So who do I go to? The police and say, well, look, there's been a breach of the law. You need to investigate this because I've been placed into gambling harm because of a breach of a GB license. I mean, the PSNI are actually very good in this, and they want to be helpful. And anytime there's engagement with them, they say, well, what can we do? But it's almost impossible for them to be the regulator for this. So we have this situation where we're in this really no man's land because we don't have control over the internet. So how can we fully be part of a levy that we set up on our own online? We only have full control over land-based gambling, which actually doesn't yield the big profits that are going to actually really shift the dial in terms of helping people in gambling harm. So it just feels to me either we give a whole chunk of this back to Westminster, certainly in terms of the online piece, to access the online levy that's been put in place for GB, or we just give everything back and have it regulated more fully there. And I'm not, yes, we should be able to do things for our population here, but I think the piece is so complicated that it makes it very difficult for us to actually know which way to twist and turn in this. And actually, I just think it would be better just to say, look, let's get into negotiations with the Westminster government. And maybe even if we don't want to hand the power back, that we do sort of a legislative consent motion when they start to change the GB regulator to try and include us in whatever those changes are. But let's be no mistake, the GB Gambling Commission isn't great shakes either, and that's recognised across the piece.
That's what I was going to ask you, Tim.
It's not great shakes.
To the extent that there is regulation, is it actually reducing harm?
It's not great. I mean, harm is much lower in England, and the Gambling Commission would point to their great work in terms of regulating harm. Really, where harm is reduced in England, Scotland and Wales is through treatment. And that's going to improve now with 100 million flowing in to the NHS across England, Scotland and Wales. That's going to be able to increase the centres that they've got. That's going to be able to increase the people who are going to be able to get access to treatment. Now, as you say, not everybody's going to be a successfully treated person in this area, but there's going to be a heck of a lot more people who are going to be removed from that harmful category because of those centres being put in place. So they've been able to do that. And also the voluntary levy before this compulsory one was much higher in England, Scotland and Wales as well. The voluntary, the money that the gambling companies pay on a voluntary basis here is derisory, whereas in England, Scotland and Wales, they did pay a lot more.
Can people from Northern Ireland access the services in GB?
Well, you'll have to get a referral, and so our GPs wouldn't be capable of referring to the NHS Scotland, England or Wales unless that's a little bit like, dare I say it, abortion services. People can only be referred there from here. When NHS England said, well, we'll pay the cost, we'll pay the flights, we'll pay for the procedure, and the movement came from them. So they would have to say, or we would need to enter into an agreement with NHS England, Scotland and Wales and say, we'll fund our people to go.
Whatever about Gordon Lyons or Mike Nesbitt, we could actually fund places in treatment centres in England. The way Mike is paying at the moment for people to go for health procedures south of the border.
Now, there is a residential element to most of this treatment, but it's once that residential element ends, if you don't have a centre close to you, and this is a criticism in England, Scotland and Wales, if the centre is not close to you, so you could be in an area that's 200 miles from a centre, you go to the residential piece, and then you're 200 miles away, so how do you get there? You don't bother turning up. So you have to have these centres close to where people need them. And I think, if we were to say, well, look, we'll just bunk in with England, we'll pay for people on a case-by-case basis to go, that would certainly put a sticking plaster on the problem, but it wouldn't be the most effective way of alleviating it. So I think it's some way we need to access the vast sums of money from this online play, and I think we can only do that if we put our lot in with a much bigger part of these islands and have a strategy that's joined up across them.
Yeah, that looks that really looks at it, and it's definitely something that we should be paying more attention to in terms of public policy and as just a wider society, because the harms out there and the amount of people being impacted by this are actually quite alarming. Gents, I really appreciate you going around the houses with me, but before we sign off and close, if anyone is impacted by this, Tim, where could they go? If anyone has been impacted by gambling harm, who would you signpost them toward?
Well, you've got to start speaking to someone, and Philip mentioned some of the people earlier on in our conversation. Look, go to your GP. Even though there's not going to be direct services that are available to you, there are things that you could be directed to within the health and social care trusts, where let's say you've got alcoholism along with gambling, there could be referrals in those instances. And even if there's not, there's ways that GPs can refer you to counselling services to help with some of these issues. So go and see your GP. There's also Dunlewey, which Philip mentioned, who is they're a charity that provide counselling for gambling addiction. And also I think a first stop really is to go to the organisation GamStop, and you can put your details in, and they will help you to close down all your accounts and help you to be able to be in a position where you can't access those accounts going forward. And so that will immediately help you to shut down that gambling. So I think that's really, so GamStop, but do speak to your GP. Even though there's not direct services, there are things that can be done, and give Dunlewey Counselling Services a ring as well if you Google that.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Tim. And to anyone who is dealing with this, and not just this addiction, but any other addiction as well, we wish you all the very best in your journey as well. And we will come back to this. So we're not just going to do a one and done on this. We will be keeping an eye on this as we go along. Just a reminder, if you want to comment on anything you're listening to, you can WhatsApp us as you're listening with questions or comments, ideally using a voice note so we can play it on next week's episode, 0333 404 6507. Remember to use the word Stormont. You can also send us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. We're getting back into the political season. Party conference season is coming up as well. So we'll have plenty to talk about and comment upon. So that's all we have time for this edition of Stormont Sources. Thank you for listening in. Please keep in touch with your ideas, questions and comments. That's all from Tim, Michael and myself. We'll see you next week.